Now we are going to have the presentation of Professor Norman Vorano. I'm going to introduce him very briefly. Professor Vorano is a scholar of historic and modern indigenous art with a specialization in Arctic arts and museum culture. He is a Queen's National Scholar in Indigenous Art and Material Culture and an Associate Professor of Art History at Queen's University, Canada. He received his PhD from the University of Rochester's program in Visual and Cultural Studies. And from 2005 to 2014, he was a curator of contemporary Inuit art at the Canadian Museum of History. Vorano has curated several international touring exhibitions, including Inuit prints, Japanese inspiration, early printmaking in the Canadian Arctic, which toured Canada and Japan, and also picturing Arctic modernity, North Bathing drawings from 1964, which toured across Canada, including satellite exhibitions in Clyde River Pond Inlet and Iqaluit, Nunavut. He has been an elected board member of the Native American Art Studies Association, served on the editorial board of the Inuit Art Quarterly, and is a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geography Society. He's a 2017 Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow for a project that will entail the development and creation of an Arctic Cultural Heritage Research Network. Please, Professor Norman.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Bom, muito obrigado, Gabriel. Boa tarde a todos. Eu estou muito feliz por estar aqui e quero agradecer aos organizadores, ICOM, International Committee for Documentation, Committee for Collecting, ICOM Brasil, Museu de Arte Moderna do Rio, and particularly Gabriel and Alexandra Matos. And thank you very much for Professor Ogbechi. It's very difficult to follow such an engaging talk. I'm coming to you from the city of Kingston on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And with that, I think it might be appropriate that I would share my screen and turn on my PowerPoint. Does that work?
Yeah, we can see it, Norman. Thank you.
Okay, bon, thank you. So I'll be speaking in English, and thank you, Laura, for translating. So the title of my talk is What's Old is New Again, Building Cultural Resilience Through Historical Museum Collections. So there are burgeoning discourses, resources, and protocols today around the ethics, methods, and practices of provenance research, much of which has developed from post-war efforts to redress Nazi-era looted art, the UNESCO's 1970 Convention on Illicit Import, and the creation of comprehensive online tools to facilitate research on the traffic in artworks in museum collections, as some of the examples you see here. These resources have created heightened expectations for museums around the world to ensure compliance with evolving national and international legal frameworks. These changes have compelled museums to exercise greater diligence to demonstrate they are the rightful custodians of cultural patrimony, and they have forced heritage institutions to address, sometimes uncomfortably, underlying questions relating to ownership, moral justice, and ethics in a world that was torn asunder through conflict, conquest, and colonialism. However, as my own point of entry, I might add that the locus of this burgeoning discussion has been about collectors, galleries, and repositories of what I would describe as kind of high-end European fine art or ancient old world antiquities, while collections of indigenous material culture, and specifically for indigenous material culture collected under the auspices of anthropology or amateur anthropology, are oftentimes only marginally explored or glanced at in this literature. Instead, discussion around the provenance of these types of collections tends to be described from within the framework of biographical portraits of the collectors themselves, if indeed they merit any inspection at all. So I want to, in my talk, I want to look at how some museums in Canada have really begun to rethink provenance research on their anthropological or ethnographical collections. These are terms that I use to acknowledge the Western impetus for the collecting of Indigenous material culture, rather than as any explicit statement of its inherent value or cultural meanings. In Indigenous contexts, in fact, collections of historical and archaeological material culture are oftentimes called ancestral beings, cultural belongings, or simply ancestors, to use some of the more frequently used terms. In the context of these evolving practices around provenance research, I'd like to acknowledge that the very prospect of decolonizing a museum, if one could be so bold as to make such a statement, must necessarily be a comprehensive, multifaceted, and holistic institutional challenge. And that's, I think, particularly the case in light of ICOM's recent declaration that museums should be polyphonic spaces that contribute to, and I quote ICOM here, human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. Showing you one of the museums that I'm going to be talking about today, the Museum of Anthropology, and I'll make reference to the other museum here. In the examples I discuss, I highlight the problematic here that museums and Indigenous communities are creating novel ways of thinking about provenance research that engage both Western and Indigenous research methodologies, sometimes in mutually supportive ways, sometimes in tension. Why provenance research? Well, given the fact that cultural collections provide evidence of land occupation, trade networks, and cultural practices, questions of provenance are recognized as being highly integral to contemporary Indigenous land claims, repatriation requests, and the development of museum protocols around sacred materials and restrictive access. For many museums in Canada with and the United States with historical collections of Indigenous material culture, the associated documentary records they hold about their collections oftentimes yields only fragmentary clues about where, when, and how an object was acquired. In some cases, contextual records were sent to archives, while the objects were sent to the museums. Provenance researchers have developed novel strategies in efforts to overcome this disassociation. I'm showing you one of these kind of a classic example of the catalog records of the National Museum of the American Indian. And what you see on the left is the historical catalog records, and that collection, huge collection, was rather famously bereft of a lot of institutional context when that National Museum was created in the 1990s out of the George Gustav High collection. So provenance researchers have developed novel strategies in efforts to overcome these kinds of gaps. Moreover, the other thing that museums have to grapple with are the simple ravages of time on archives or institutional reorganizations that have routinely alienated records from objects, such as when, and I show you here at my home university, Queen's University, in the 19th century, ethnographic collections, which were unsystematically made by geologists, physicians, and engineers working on behalf of Queen's University, were kind of orphaned when the sponsoring faculty member retired. And here I show you an example of a Haida or Tsimshian raven rattle that was most likely collected by Dr. Archibald Malloch, who is a Queen's trained physician, who made collections on his travels across Canada in the 19th century. And these collections, and there are other collections at Queen's quite like what I'm showing you here, were actually kind of shunted around the university from one building to the other for decades after the death of the collector. And pieces that survived into the 20th century were kind of unceremoniously deposited into the basement of the university's newly founded art gallery, which opened its doors in 1957. I'll show you a photo of the gallery now. Associated documentation for these objects was either discarded or retained in the personal archives of the collectors and dispersed elsewhere, since the gallery was predominantly interested in showcasing these works as aesthetic objects, shorn of that anthropological, so to speak, context. So the legacy of this, I want to show you the online search screen for our university gallery. And when you search a keyword, and I put in the word frontlit, which is what that object was called that you saw in the previous slide, this is the record that's pulled up for this work. So as you can see, this is an acknowledged, this is an impoverished record with a questionable community attribution, though it does acknowledge the donor, Dr. Archibald Malik, who was that physician who traveled around Canada to make collections. The gallery, in fact, does not share a photograph of this piece with the general public, but it does, and as you can see here, for the reasons that it gives is that it does release photos, quote, for Indigenous community members, unquote. So it's not clear which Indigenous community members would have access to the photographs, nor is it clear at the gallery who would kind of vet the legitimacy of these requests to ensure that applicants have appropriate connections to the communities. The matter is further complicated in this case because basic provenance questions are not determined, and so there's no clearly established community of origin for this particular piece. So, you know, these are pretty familiar historical circumstances for Indigenous collections in Western museums. And the contemporary conundrums relate to the very workings of the colonial project itself. And in this case, I would argue, they very much reinscribe the power of the museum to access who can see objects and who can gain access to objects. So it's the museum here that is the ultimate arbiter of control over cultural collections. So these are familiar circumstances. What I want to show now are two innovative research partnerships that have not only attempted to restore contextual records around Indigenous museum collections, but they both work in close partnership with Indigenous communities to revise and rethink some of the very categories that museums use and the language that they use to document artworks themselves. And these two projects, they respect sacred materials and access restrictions, yet they work to create and share knowledge of collections in order to build more culturally resilient Indigenous communities that partner with them. So the first example that I want to show here is the Reciprocal Research Network. Some of you might be familiar with it. Many of you might be, in fact. And this was developed at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia under the directorship of Ruth Phillips. And this project actually started in the late 1990s, although it was really built in the mid-2000s. It began as a major effort to renew the galleries and expand or address collection storage problems. The Museum of Anthropology, or MOA as it's called, has a very large and one of the most substantial Northwest Coast anthropological collections in the world, as well as kind of world anthropological, historical, and cultural collections. And in the 1990s, the museum realized that its 1960s era Arthur Erickson building was simply too small and in need of major redevelopment and upgrading. But as the museum began to write its federal grant application for its infrastructure renewal, it quickly realized that it actually must reconsider the very purpose and social significance of itself as a research institution. The museum decided to create a dual partnership. The museum decided to create a dual project entitled A Partnership of Peoples, which had a physical space component and a virtual space component, and both of which would be developed in close consultation with the Musqueam Indian Band, the Stolo Nation, and the Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay. And these three communities represents three indigenous nations that are in proximity to the university and represented certainly in the university's collections. So the resulting, one of the outputs of this was a virtual space, and that's what I'll focus on, and that's called a reciprocal research network. It's an online database of museum collections from around the world, actually, with records of the objects alongside all associated documentation, including photographs, video, and original registration or catalog cards. The original intent of the Reciprocal Research Network was to be focusing only on Northwest Coast cultural collections, which have been collected and dispersed around the globe and reside in museums in Asia, across Europe, the US, and the Antipodes. But the RRN has subsequently expanded to include all of the Museum of Anthropology's collections and is increasingly incorporating diverse museum collections from other museums. So the idea behind the RRN was to provide a single virtual portal for members of the three partnering indigenous bands to easily search for their ancestral collections, which are scattered amongst those museums around the world. But moreover, the idea was to create a virtual network where indigenous and non-indigenous researchers can upload and share information about objects in a manner that respects intellectual property and community protocols around sensitive information. So to be a user of the RRN, you must apply and create a profile. Here I'm showing you my own login page on the site. So access is password protected and any information uploaded is attributed and date stamped. I'll add that it's actually very easy to get access to the site by simply emailing the coordinators. So users can not only search and upload information themselves, but they can create social communities with other users. They can virtually save and share collections in their personal profile as a project. And I'm showing you just publicly visible project pages that users have set up here. And importantly, they can control how and to whom their intellectual property is shared in a spectrum that is entirely private to fully public, including the source museum. So a kind of a novel way, a good way to imagine the RRN is as if the good things about social media, connectivity, sharing, community, the ability to make little micro groups, were grafted onto a museum's online database, which have historically been restricted to a small group of gatekeepers who can oftentimes see and only modify records. So as the anthropologist Elaine Schultz wrote, the purpose of the RRN is not simply to unite people with objects, but to unite people with people. The site has a comprehensive help guide, which was designed to assist university-level researchers as well as new users who have little experience navigating complex museum search websites, as well as clear directions about how to share knowledge about an item. And this is particularly important. I mean, I'm a museum person. I have a PhD, and I do research on museums, and I find navigating a lot of museums websites to be dreadfully difficult. I imagine what a 70-year-old woman in a small indigenous community who has very little access to the internet, how they would try to navigate this. So this website provides assistance and is a single portal for them. So the site provides video tutorials for users to walk through its many features and invites indigenous community members to contact the RRN administrators if there are culturally sensitive images that should only be made available to certain individuals. Users can initiate or participate in a public discussion page. You see here just an example of the recent discussion page. And as you can see, the types of discussions are wide-ranging, from university researchers seeking information about specific topics and objects, to collectors wanting to know information about their recent finds, to Indigenous community members asking about a language translation, among many other topics. The site also supports orthographies in different Indigenous languages by storing all translations in Unicode, and it includes language translation pages, so users can not only see different translations of terminology used across the site, but the users themselves can contribute to refining translations. So the site really is a living and organic repository of information, not only about provenance, but about language, contextual meanings of objects, cultural understandings around sensitivities and protocols, and histories. I just very briefly want to walk you through one search example of the type of object I attempted to search at my own university gallery. So this is the search page at the Reciprocal Research Network. But typing the word frontlet into the as a general keyword search brings me to 173 items, which includes archival photographs of high-ranking men wearing frontlets. These photographs were in museum archives, along with different physical objects, so the frontlet themselves, from various partnering museums, including the Museum of Anthropology, of course, but also the Burke Museum at the University of Washington, Portland Art Museum, the Amista Cultural Center, which is an Indigenous cultural center in Alert Bay, the Museum of Vancouver, the Penn Museum, the National Museum of the American Indians, Smithsonian Institution, Brooklyn Museum, American Museum of Natural History, and many others. I think there are about 20-something partnering institutions. If I had to search for frontlets through these museums' individual search pages, it would have taken me hours. RRN is an active site that pulls information directly from the museum's respective search pages. So there is a continuous sharing of information between the RRN and its partnering museums. So when you click on an object, and I'll click on that frontlet right here, this brings you to the item record. This one happens to be from the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian. And further down, it's a little further down in the search, we can see we not only have a variety of high resolution photographs, but we also have a photograph of the original cataloging card, even though this information from the original card is also entered as searchable data on the record. This is vitally important, as anyone who has researched provenance knows, since the card sometimes includes valuable information that's lost when the information is transferred into a database. Subtle things like differences in handwriting, the color of ink. This is actually black and white here because it's a copy of a card. I think the original card is lost, although I can't speak to that. But subtle things like differences in handwriting on the cards, markups, the color of ink, and other markings reveal important clues about the social biography of an object in a museum collection. As well, the real strength of the RRN is that object records may include details that have been uploaded by different users, including multimedia files, although you can click the link on the top of each record to go to the original record in the host institution. So clicking from the RRN will also bring you to the National Museum of the American Indians record, in which case this provides the fixed link to that artifact. This feature allows users to see how an object is described by its custodian institution versus the way it's described by the RRN community. And it also preserves the autonomy of the custodian museum, which was actually an important part of allowing institutions and encouraging them to sign on to this, which would, most institutions would most likely not allow their original records to be modified by users. So this is kind of one of the more sophisticated examples of how a Canadian institution is rethinking provenance research to better support Indigenous communities through innovative models of reciprocal learning. The RRN is governed by a steering group comprised of representatives from the Musqueam Nation, the Mysticultural Center, the Stolo Nation, as well as representatives from the Museum of Anthropology, and all of whom make recommendations that affect the overall scope of the network and its budget and the like. Additionally, the site has several community liaisons who are tasked to ensure its usability, support, and ensure that the needs of communities, Indigenous communities, are taken into account on all levels. The other example that I just want to very, very briefly mention is kind of the stepchild of the Reciprocal Research Network, which is called the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Arts and Culture, or GRACEAC. This was also spearheaded by Ruth Phillips at Carleton University in early 2005. And this is a project that I had actually worked close on in its very early days with Professor Phillips. This Reciprocal Research Network includes partnering communities of the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation on Manitoulin Island, the Woodland Cultural Center in Brantford, Ontario, Cornell University, University of Toronto, and of course, Carleton University, where it's hosted. Though not as large as the RRN, it's similar in many respects and also has a steering committee comprised of academic and non-academic members. And it also integrates Indigenous language, user-generated content, intellectual property protocols into a searchable knowledge sharing system to provide digital access to Great Lakes Indigenous cultural items held in museums and archives around the world, including objects, documents, photographs, material culture, and audiovisual files. Like the RRN, the site also allows researchers and community members to reconnect material objects that were disassociated during the colonial collecting scramble or through the Western museumification of objects. And like the RRN, the intent is to connect people to people through collections. Both of these research networks remain very active today, and I should add that GRACEAC is as well, it is as well password protected, and you have to have an account. These are sites that not only assist in comprehensive provenance research on collections that oftentimes have very abbreviated documentary records, but more importantly, they support Indigenous cultural revitalization, language study, and cultural expression. RRN in particular is used by a lot of First Nations artists from the West Coast. These sites acknowledge and create a meaningful and respectful space for the coexistence of both Western and Indigenous ways of research, while drawing upon the strengths of both approaches to revitalize collections and their records. A part of the complication here that I think we have to deal with is the very term provenance itself, which presents specific challenges for Indigenous collections in Western museums. Nick Pierce and Jane Miloch's recent and very engaging book, Collecting and Provenance, notes that although the basic definition of provenance originally referred to a place of origin of a work of art, really, the term has come to encompass a richer and more nuanced understanding of the myriad contexts, networks, and social relationships that have been woven into an object's history through time. In some of the ways that Professor Ogbechi's talk spoke to in greater detail. This is an important facet of understanding the challenges of provenance research in historical Indigenous collections, since there are many examples of objects that were created by one community, traded to another community as a status good, modified by that community, and then traded elsewhere, all before the arrival of the European collector. This really poses a challenge to provenance researchers, since the impulse for traditional provenance researchers is to assert a sole tribal origin to an object. How does one identify the sole source community under such circumstances? Who is the rightful claimant of such objects? Should they be subject to repatriation requests? How does one mete that out? Sites like the Reciprocal Research Network or GRACEAC demonstrate that museum objects are inherently entangled in complex social networks, and that their meanings are polyphonic and very generative of cultural invention and new forms of social reproduction. So provenance research in these areas is not only acknowledging the role of the collector or the museum for that matter, but the possibilities for indigenizing museums and working to undo their colonial legacies. So thank you very much.